The shove came out of nowhere. 1 second, Jasmine Washington was standing tall at the top of the jetway ramp. The next, she was falling metal and pain blurring together. Blood ran down her face as passengers screamed. The flight attendant above her didn't reach to help. She only glared, muttering something about people like you. What Deborah Miller didn't know was that her victim wasn't just another passenger. Jasmine was the daughter of one of America's most powerful CEOs, and her phone had captured every second of the assault. Within hours, that video would set the entire airline industry on fire. The morning had begun like any other for Jasmine Washington. At 27, she was already a force in the business world, having graduated with an MBA from Harvard and quickly risen to an executive position at Horizon Technologies. Of course, it helped that her father, Malcolm Washington, was the founder and CEO of the Fortune 500 company, but anyone who worked with Jasmine knew her success came from her own brilliance and determination. Jasmine stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully applying her makeup with practiced precision. Her reflection showed a young woman with intelligent eyes and a confident posture that came from years of navigating predominantly white corporate spaces. Today was important. She was flying to Chicago for a meeting that could potentially expand Horizon's reach into new markets. "Remember what I always tell you?" Malcolm had said during their phone call the previous evening. His deep voice carried the weight of decades of experience. "You have to be twice as good to get half as far. Keep your composure no matter what. Document everything." I know Dad Jasmine had replied, having heard this advice countless times throughout her life, but she never dismissed it because she knew it came from her father's own painful experiences climbing the corporate ladder as a black man in America. Malcolm Washington had built Horizon Technologies from nothing, transforming it from a small startup in his garage to a company valued at billions. Along the way, he'd faced every form of discrimination imaginable, from being mistaken for janitorial staff at his own company meetings to having security called on him when he attempted to access the executive floor. Jasmine had her own collection of such stories, like the time in business school when a professor consistently mixed her up with the only other black woman in class despite them looking nothing alike. Or the countless moments in stores when salespeople would ignore her until she mentioned her family name. Or worst of all, the incident 2 years ago at the Thompson Hotel when security had aggressively questioned her presence in the executive lounge despite her keycard access. These experiences had taught Jasmine to be methodical about travel. She never left anything to chance. First-class ticket purchased well in advance. Professional attire today. A tailored navy pants suit with subtle gold accessories. Arrival at the airport 2 hours before departure. Rewards membership cards and ID easily accessible. A polite but reserved demeanor that gave no one any reason to question her belonging in premium spaces. Her best friend, Alyssa Brooks, dropped her at the airport departures terminal. "Text me when you land," Alyssa said, giving Jasmine a quick hug before she exited the car. "And watch yourself with Skylink. There was that incident last month with the basketball player." Jasmine nodded, recalling the news story about a professional athlete who'd been harassed by airline staff despite having a first-class ticket. "I'll be fine," she assured Alyssa. "I've got the Skylink routine down by now." Inside the terminal, the check-in process seemed smooth enough. The agent at the premium counter was professional, if not particularly warm. Jasmine noticed how the same agent had cheerfully chatted with the white businessman ahead of her, but she pushed the observation aside. Not every interaction needed to be analyzed for racial undertones, though she couldn't help but catalogue these subtle differences. It wasn't until she reached the gate that the first sign of trouble emerged. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with a tight ponytail, looked up from her computer with a frown when Jasmine presented her boarding pass. "First class?" The agent asked, her tone suggesting skepticism. "Yes," Jasmine replied calmly. The agent looked at Jasmine's ID, then back at her face, then at the computer. "Washington, Jasmine Washington. And how did you acquire this ticket?" Jasmine felt a familiar tension creeping into her shoulders. "I purchased it through the Skylink app like I always do," the gate agent murmured, tapping away at her keyboard. "The system shows this was an expensive ticket purchased only a week ago." Yes, Jasmine confirmed, maintaining her composure. Business needs sometimes arise on short notice. After a few more uncomfortable seconds of scrutiny, the agent reluctantly handed back Jasmine's documents. Very well. Boarding will begin in 20 minutes. As Jasmine took a seat in the waiting area, she pulled out her phone and made a brief note of the interaction time-place employee description just in case. Malcolm's words echoed in her mind. Document everything. She had no idea just how important that habit would prove to be in the hours ahead. When the announcement for first-class boarding came over the loudspeaker, Jasmine gathered her carry-on luggage and laptop bag. She had dressed deliberately today, as she always did for business travel. Her navy pants suit was from a high-end designer. Her shoes were Italian leather, and her jewelry was understated but clearly expensive. Her natural hair was styled in a neat professional updo. Everything about her appearance had been carefully calculated to project success and belonging in premium spaces. As she approached the jetway, she encountered flight attendant Deborah Miller for the first time. Deborah stood at the entrance greeting passengers with practiced efficiency. At 42, Deborah had been with Skylink Airlines for 15 years. She had started her career with enthusiasm and genuine warmth, but years of demanding passengers, corporate cutbacks, and personal disappointments had hardened her. Just last month, she'd been passed over for the senior cabin manager position she'd coveted for years. The promotion instead going to a younger colleague with half her experience but connections to upper management. What passengers couldn't see was Deborah's personal life unraveling. A messy divorce, mounting debt, and her mother's recent dementia diagnosis had left her perpetually on edge. But beneath these legitimate struggles lurked something darker, unconscious biases that Deborah would vehemently deny if confronted directly. "Good morning," Jasmine said with a polite smile as she presented her boarding pass. Deborah gave her a cursory glance, barely making eye contact as she scanned the ticket. Her expression remained neutral, bordering on cold. "Sat 2A, she stated flatly. Jasmine nodded and was about to move past when she noticed the stark difference in Deborah's demeanor as the white businessman behind her stepped forward. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard." Deborah's voice transformed, suddenly warm and enthusiastic, heading to Chicago for business or pleasure. "Business, unfortunately," the man replied with a chuckle. "Well, we'll try to make your flight as pleasant as possible," Deborah assured him with a wide smile. "Let me know if you need anything at all during the flight." The contrast was so striking that Jasmine paused momentarily on the jetway. She pulled out her phone and discreetly added another note to her documentation. This wasn't paranoia. It was a pattern she had observed countless times before. As Jasmine continued down the jetway, a man about her age caught up with her. "Pretty obvious, wasn't it?" he commented quietly. Jasmine turned, surprised by the stranger's perception. Tyler Reynolds was 35, a marketing executive who traveled frequently for business. As a white man who had grown up in a diverse neighborhood in Chicago, he had learned to recognize the subtle forms of discrimination that his black friends and colleagues experienced. "I've flown this route twice a month for 3 years, Tyler explained. "That flight attendant is usually professional, if not exactly friendly. But that was something else." "Thanks for noticing," Jasmine replied, grateful for the acknowledgement, but cautious about engaging too deeply with a stranger. As they reached the aircraft door, another flight attendant directed Tyler to his seat, while Deborah reappeared to guide Jasmine. "Let me verify your seat assignment again," Deborah said, taking Jasmine's boarding pass a second time. "Is there a problem?" Jasmine asked calmly. Just following procedure, Deborah replied, though no other first-class passenger had received this double-check. Once seated in 2, Jasmine observed as Deborah warmly welcomed other first-class passengers, offering to hang up coats and serve pre-flight beverages. When Deborah finally approached Jasmine, her demeanor changed again. "Would you like a drink?" she asked curtly. "Water, please," Jasmine responded. Minutes later, Deborah returned with a plastic cup of water for Jasmine while distributing glass tumblers to other first-class passengers. The pattern continued as boarding proceeded. Jasmine documented each discrepancy on her phone using the Notes app that automatically synced to her cloud storage. She noticed Tyler watching these interactions from across the aisle, his expression increasingly troubled. Just as the final boarding call was announced, Deborah approached Jasmine again. "Excuse me, I need to verify your identification again." Jasmine maintained her composure. "May I ask why my boarding pass has already been scanned twice? We've had issues with seat assignments recently." Deborah claimed her tone suggesting Jasmine was causing unnecessary trouble. "It's standard procedure." "Is it? I don't see you asking anyone else for additional verification," Jasmine pointed out calmly. Deborah's expression hardened. "If you're unwilling to comply with safety procedures, I'll need to call my supervisor." Jasmine recognized the escalation tactic, but remained collected. "I'm happy to comply with legitimate procedures. I'm simply asking why I'm being singled out. I'll get my supervisor," Deborah stated, turning away before Jasmine could respond. In that moment, Jasmine made a decision. She discreetly activated the video recording function on her phone and placed it in her jacket pocket with the camera lens just visible. Malcolm's voice echoed in her mind again. "Document everything." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Several passengers avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the unfolding situation, but unwilling to get involved. Others watched with undisguised curiosity, and Tyler Reynolds observed with growing concern, his hand hovering over his own phone, sensing that what was happening might require a witness. The tension in the first-class cabin grew thicker as Deborah Miller marched up the aisle toward the front of the plane, presumably to find her supervisor. Jasmine sat perfectly still, her expression neutral, despite the turmoil she felt inside. Years of navigating similar situations had taught her that showing any emotion, particularly anger, would only reinforce stereotypes and potentially escalate the situation. "I'm within my rights to ask for consistent treatment," Jasmine said softly to herself, a calming technique her therapist had recommended for stressful situations. Her phone continued recording in her pocket as she waited. Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended to be absorbed in magazines or their devices. Tyler Reynolds, however, had abandoned any pretense of disinterest and was watching the situation unfold with growing concern. Within minutes, Deborah returned with a man in his 50s, wearing a Skylink supervisor badge that identified him as Craig Peters. His expression was stern as he approached Jasmine's seat. "Ma'am, I understand there's an issue with compliance." He began, his tone suggesting he had already decided who was at fault in this situation. Jasmine maintained her professional demeanor. "There's no issue with compliance, sir. I've presented my boarding pass twice and had my identification verified at the gate. I'm simply asking why I'm being asked for additional verification when no other passengers in first class have been approached with the same request." Craig glanced at Deborah, who stood with her arms crossed. "Miss Miller is following our security protocols. We reserve the right to verify passenger identity at any time." "I understand that," Jasmine replied evenly. "What I'm asking is why those protocols appear to only apply to me among all the first-class passengers." Craig's expression hardened. "Ma'am, if you continue to be disruptive, I'm not being disruptive." Jasmine interrupted, her voice still calm but firm. "I'm asking a straightforward question about what appears to be discriminatory treatment." The word discriminatory caused Craig to straighten his posture defensively. "We don't discriminate at Skylink Airlines, ma'am. We're simply—" "My name is Jasmine Washington," she said, deciding it was time to be more direct. "I'm an executive at Horizon Technologies, and my father is Malcolm Washington, the CEO. I fly frequently for business, and I've never experienced this level of scrutiny on any other flight with your airline or any other." The shift in Craig's demeanor was immediate and telling. His eyes widened slightly at the Washington name. Malcolm Washington's reputation in the business world was legendary. He cleared his throat, suddenly looking much less certain. "Miss Washington, I apologize for any inconvenience." His tone abruptly softened. "I'm sure we can resolve this quickly." From beside him, Deborah's expression darkened, her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched her supervisor's complete reversal. "So, my concerns are valid now that you know who my father is?" Jasmine asked, highlighting the hypocrisy. That's precisely the problem I'm addressing. Craig looked increasingly uncomfortable. Miss Washington, please accept our apologies for any misunderstanding. Of course you're welcome aboard our flight. Miss Miller, he turned to Deborah. Please ensure Miss Washington receives our premium service. The look that crossed Deborah's face contained a mixture of resentment and forced compliance. Yes, sir, she replied tightly. I'd appreciate an apology from Miss Miller as well, Jasmine stated calmly. The discriminatory treatment began with her. Craig gave Deborah a pointed look. The flight attendant's face flushed with a combination of embarrassment and anger. I apologize for any misunderstanding. Deborah said the words coming out stiff and insincere. By now, the entire first-class cabin was watching the interaction, and passengers in the economy section were starting to notice the delay in completing the boarding process. Tyler Reynolds had his own phone out now, though not obviously recording. Thank you, Jasmine replied. I appreciate your acknowledgement and hope the rest of the flight will proceed professionally. Craig nodded clearly, eager to end the confrontation. Again, our apologies, Miss Washington. You'll have no further issues. Miss Miller will ensure your flight is comfortable. As Craig exited the aircraft, presumably returning to his gate duties, the tension should have dissipated. Instead, it seemed to crystallize around Deborah, whose body language communicated barely contained fury. She moved stiffly through her pre-flight duties, avoiding eye contact with Jasmine. The boarding process resumed with the remaining passengers filing past the first-class cabin toward the economy section. Jasmine's phone continued recording in her pocket, capturing the aftermath of the confrontation. About 10 minutes later, an announcement came over the intercom. Flight attendants prepare for departure. As part of this procedure, Deborah needed to check that the jetway door was secure. As she moved toward the door, she paused beside Jasmine's seat. Some people think they're entitled to special treatment, she muttered, just loudly enough for Jasmine to hear. Jasmine looked up, meeting her gaze directly. Equal treatment isn't special treatment, Miss Miller. Something, and Deborah snapped. The flight is delayed because of your disruption, she hissed. You need to plane immediately for further security screening. Jasmine remained calm. There's been no disruption on my part, and your supervisor already resolved the situation. I'm not leaving my seat. Then I'll have to insist, Deborah said, her voice rising. Please gather your belongings and follow me. Several passengers gasped at the escalation. Tyler Reynolds stood up from his seat. Excuse me, but I've witnessed this entire interaction, and Miss Washington has done nothing wrong. Deborah ignored him, focusing her anger on Jasmine. Miss Washington, this is your final warning. Jasmine remained seated. I'm not leaving this flight without legitimate cause. If you feel there's an issue, please have your supervisor return. Fine, Deborah snapped. Let's go speak to him right now. She gestured toward the door of the aircraft, which still connected to the jetway, recognizing that resolving this away from the audience of passengers might be best. Jasmine carefully stood, ensuring her phone was still recording. I'm happy to speak with your supervisor again, but I'll be returning to my seat afterward. She followed Deborah toward the aircraft door and onto the jetway. As soon as they were out of view of the other passengers, Deborah's demeanor changed completely. You people always think you deserve special treatment, she snarled, dropping all pretense of professionalism. Excuse me, Jasmine replied, startled by the sudden aggression. Just because your daddy runs some company doesn't make you special here. Deborah continued, stepping closer to Jasmine, who instinctively stepped back. I never asked for special treatment. Jasmine maintained her composure, though her heart was pounding. Just equal treatment. Equal treatment. Deborah mimicked with contempt. You got me reprimanded. Do you know how long I've worked for this airline? Jasmine took another step back, finding herself at the top of the slight decline in the jetway ramp. Your behavior got you reprimanded, not me. What happened next occurred so quickly that Jasmine barely had time to react. Deborah's hand shot out, connecting with Jasmine's shoulders with surprising force. The shove sent Jasmine backward, losing her balance on the incline of the jetway. Jasmine's body slammed against the metal railing before she tumbled down the ramp, her head striking the hard surface. Pain exploded across her forehead as she came to rest at the bottom of the incline. Blood began trickling from a gash on her head. Passengers who had been looking out the aircraft windows gasped in horror at what they just witnessed. And through it all, Jasmine's phone recorded everything: the assault, Deborah's expression of shock at her own actions, and the immediate scramble of airline staff who had seen the incident. As Jasmine lay dazed on the jetway floor, she heard footsteps rushing toward her, and Deborah's voice now panicked. She tripped. I tried to catch her. Through the fog of pain, Jasmine managed to speak clearly enough for her phone to pick up. My father runs Horizon Tech, and you just assaulted me on camera. Chaos erupted on the jetway as the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. Jasmine Washington, daughter of one of America's most powerful CEOs, lay injured on the metal flooring, blood seeping from the wound on her forehead. The shocking assault had been witnessed by numerous passengers peering out of the aircraft windows, several of whom were already on their phones, some calling for help, and others undoubtedly sharing the incident on social media. Someone calls security. A passenger shouted from the doorway of the plane. She needs medical attention, called another. Deborah Miller stood frozen, the color draining from her face as the magnitude of her actions dawned on her. In a moment of blind rage, she had potentially destroyed her career and exposed her company to a catastrophic lawsuit. Her shock quickly transformed into self-preservation. She became aggressive and then tripped. Deborah began saying to anyone who would listen, "I was trying to prevent her fall," but Tyler Reynolds had followed Jasmine and Deborah onto the jetway, his own phone recording. "That's not what happened," he stated firmly. "I saw you push her. Clear as day." Airline staff materialized from both directions of the jetway. A gate agent who had witnessed the incident through the terminal window looked horrified. "What did you do, Deborah?" she whispered. Deborah Miller stood frozen, the color draining from her face as the magnitude of her actions dawned on her. In a moment of blind rage, she had potentially destroyed her career and exposed her company to a catastrophic lawsuit. Her shock quickly transformed into self-preservation. "Ma'am, what happened here?" one officer asked, his tone suggesting Jasmine might have been the instigator rather than the victim. Before she could answer, Tyler stepped forward. This flight attendant, he pointed at Deborah, deliberately pushed her down the ramp after a dispute about discriminatory treatment. Other passengers who had gathered at the aircraft door nodded in agreement. "We all saw it." An elderly woman confirmed that poor girl did nothing wrong. As a small crowd gathered, a man in a Skylink management uniform rushed onto the jetway. "Everyone back on the plane, please," he ordered, then lowered his voice to speak to the security officers. "We need to handle this discreetly." Jasmine, now sitting up but still dazed, kept one hand protectively over the pocket containing her phone. The recording was still going, capturing every word. A medical team arrived with a first aid kit and began examining Jasmine's wound. "You might need stitches," one EMT murmured as she cleaned the blood from Jasmine's forehead. "Possible concussion too." The Skylink manager, whose badge identified him as Richard Coleman, Vice President of Customer Experience, knelt beside Jasmine with a concerned expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Washington, on behalf of Skylink Airlines, I want to express our deepest apologies for this unfortunate accident," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Accident," Tyler interrupted incredulously. "She was deliberately pushed." Coleman shot him a warning glance before turning back to Jasmine. "We'll need to document this incident properly. I'll need to take your phone as part of our investigation. It's company policy for incidents on our property." Jasmine, despite her injury, recognized the tactic immediately. "My phone stays with me," she stated firmly. "I must insist," Coleman pressed. "Our privacy policies prohibit recording on Skylink premises without consent. That policy doesn't supersede my right to document an assault against my person." Jasmine countered, her mind clearing as her legal training kicked in. "And my phone is my personal property." While this exchange was happening, Jasmine had discreetly tapped the screen in her pocket, sending the video recording to her cloud storage and simultaneously to her father's private email address. A security officer seemingly aligned with the airline's interests approached. "Ma'am, if you're refusing to cooperate with the airline's investigation..." Tyler stepped in again. She's the victim here. She's bleeding, and you're trying to confiscate evidence. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of more medical personnel with a wheelchair. "We need to get her to the airport medical center," one stated authoritatively as they helped Jasmine into the wheelchair. Coleman leaned in close. "Miss Washington, Skylink values your business. I'm sure we can resolve this matter quietly. Your father's company has a long-standing corporate relationship with our airline." The implication was clear. A cover-up was being offered in exchange for preserving business ties. Jasmine looked him directly in the eyes. "My father values integrity above all else, Mr. Coleman. Do you really think he would prioritize a business relationship over his daughter's safety and dignity?" Coleman's confident expression faltered slightly as they began wheeling Jasmine away. Deborah Miller was being escorted in the opposite direction by airline staff, her face a mask of barely controlled panic. "This isn't fair." She could be heard saying she's exaggerating what happened because of who her father is. Meanwhile, in the background, Coleman was already on his phone. "Sir, we have a situation involving Malcolm Washington's daughter." "Yes, that Malcolm Washington. It's potentially very serious." "No, sir. It's already being contained." What Coleman didn't realize was that containment was already impossible. Several passengers had captured portions of the aftermath on their phones. Tyler Reynolds had extensive footage. And most importantly, Jasmine's complete recording from the initial discriminatory treatment through the assault was now safely backed up and in her father's possession. As Jasmine was wheeled toward the medical center, she finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability, wincing from the pain. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the reality of what had happened was setting in. But beneath the pain and shock, a steely determination took hold. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who had ever faced discrimination and been expected to remain silent. Do you think Jasmine was right to stand her ground throughout this ordeal? Comment number 1, if you believe she handled the situation perfectly by documenting everything and remaining calm. Comment number 2, if you think she should have been more confrontational from the start. What would you have done in her situation? Can corporations really hide incidents like this in today's connected world? Like this video if you believe social media has changed the power dynamic between big companies and individuals. Subscribe to hear what happens next in this shocking true story of discrimination. Will Malcolm Washington's response change the airline industry forever? How does a powerful CEO react when his own daughter becomes a victim of racial prejudice? The investigation is just beginning, and what happens next will shock you. But first, let's see how Malcolm Washington receives the disturbing video of his daughter being assaulted. Malcolm Washington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 52nd floor of the Horizon Technologies headquarters in Atlanta. At 55, he cut an impressive figure 6'2" with broad shoulders that still reflected his college football days, though his hair had gone completely silver in the past decade. He was reviewing quarterly projections on his tablet when his executive assistant, Patricia, rushed in without knocking something she had never done in 15 years. "Sir, you need to see this immediately," she said, her usual composure shattered. "It's Jasmine." Malcolm's heart rate spiked instantly. A parent's worst fear. "What happened?" "She just sent you an email marked urgent with a video attachment. I received a copy too. She's been assaulted on a Skylink flight." Malcolm's fingers trembled slightly as he opened the email, a rare show of emotion for a man known for his unshakable calm under pressure. As the video began playing, his expression remained stoic, but the muscle tightening in his jaw and the darkening of his eyes revealed the fury building within him. He watched the entire recording in silence, the discriminatory treatment, the confrontation with the supervisor, and finally the shocking assault on the jetway. When the video ended with Jasmine's voice stating, "My father runs Horizon Tech and you just assaulted me on camera," Malcolm placed the tablet carefully on his desk. "Get me the CEO of Skylink on the phone," he said to Patricia, his voice deceptively quiet. "Then call our jet. I want it ready to fly to Chicago within the hour." As Patricia hurried to execute his instructions, Malcolm stood motionless, processing what he had just witnessed. For a moment, he was transported back 30 years to an incident early in his career when he had been physically removed from a client meeting by security because they didn't believe a young black man could possibly be the software engineer they were expecting. That day had transformed his approach to business and life. He had channeled his rage into building Horizon Technologies, determined to create a company where such discrimination would never be tolerated. He had taught Jasmine to document everything to maintain her composure to work twice as hard. And now, watching his daughter bleed on an airport jetway, he questioned whether any of it had really changed the world. But Malcolm Washington had not become a billionaire CEO by succumbing to emotional reactions. Within minutes, he had moved from shock to strategic action. He called his chief legal counsel, Sandra Martinez. "Sandra, I need you. In my office immediately. Bring James from PR. We have a crisis situation involving Jasmine." Next, he contacted the board chair, explaining that he would be unavailable for the afternoon board meeting due to a family emergency. Then he made a series of quick calls to his most trusted allies in the business world, other CEOs, investors, and industry leaders who owed him favors or who had shown themselves to be genuine allies in the fight against corporate discrimination. By the time Sandra Martinez and James Wilson arrived at his office, Malcolm had a preliminary strategy mapped out. Jasmine has been physically assaulted by a Skylink flight attendant in what appears to be a racially motivated incident. He explained, showing them the video. She's currently receiving medical attention in Chicago. Sandra, an experienced litigator who had been with Horizon for a decade, watched the video with growing outrage. This is assault battery and clear evidence of discriminatory treatment. The airline's liability is beyond question. James Wilson, the PR director, was already taking notes. The optics couldn't be worse for Skylink. This will be a media firestorm once it breaks. Which is why we need to control the narrative, Malcolm stated. James, prepare a statement, but don't release anything yet. Sandra, I want you on the plane with me to Chicago. We'll need a team of our best attorneys ready to move on this immediately. As they discussed strategy, Patricia returned. Sir, I have Thomas Blackwell, CEO of Skylink on line 1, and your jet will be ready in 45 minutes. Malcolm nodded. Tell the pilot I'll need the fastest possible flight time to Chicago. He pressed the button for line 1. Thomas, Malcolm Washington, I believe we have a serious situation to discuss. The conversation was brief and icy. Blackwell attempted to characterize the incident as a misunderstanding that was being thoroughly investigated. Malcolm cut him off. Thomas, I've seen video of your employee assaulting my daughter after subjecting her to discriminatory treatment. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a crime caught on camera. I'll be in Chicago within hours, and we'll continue this conversation when I've ensured my daughter's well-being. By the time Malcolm boarded his private jet an hour later, reports of the incident were beginning to appear on social media. A blurry clip taken by a passenger showed Jasmine being wheeled away from the jetway, blood visible on her face. The hashtag number, Justice for Jasmine, was already gaining traction. During the flight, Malcolm received an update from Jasmine herself. She had received 4 stitches for the gash on her forehead and was being monitored for a mild concussion. Despite the doctor's recommendation that she rest, she was already working with a local Horizon attorney who had been dispatched to the airport medical center. "I'm proud of you," Malcolm told his daughter over the secure line. "You handled yourself exactly as you should have. I kept thinking about what you've always taught me." Jasmine replied, her voice stronger than he expected. "Document everything. Stay calm. Know your rights. I'll be there soon," he promised. "We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As the jet began its descent into Chicago, Malcolm received word that Skylink had released a statement describing the incident as an unfortunate accident during boarding and stating that flight attendant Deborah Miller had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. There was no acknowledgement of the discriminatory treatment or the deliberate nature of the assault. Malcolm's phone buzzed with messages from other CEOs and business leaders who had seen the emerging news. Many expressed outrage and offered support. Several who had corporate contracts with Skylink were already questioning their relationships with the airline. When Malcolm arrived at the airport medical center, he transformed the waiting room into an impromptu command center. Legal teams from both Chicago and Atlanta coordinated strategy. PR specialists monitored the evolving social media response. And most importantly, Malcolm spent time with Jasmine, listening to her full account of what had happened. "This isn't just about me," Jasmine told her father, determination evident despite her bandaged forehead. "This is about changing a culture that allows this kind of treatment to happen." Malcolm nodded, squeezing his daughter's hand. "And that's exactly what we're going to do." Outside the medical center, reporters had begun to gather. Skylink representatives attempted to control access to the facility, but their efforts were undermined when the elderly passenger who had witnessed the assault approached the media. "This isn't just about me," Jasmine told her father, determination evident despite her bandaged forehead. "This is about changing a culture that allows this kind of treatment to happen." As night fell in Chicago, Malcolm Washington received word that Skylink stock had already dropped 5% in after-hours trading as news of the incident spread. But he wasn't focused on the financial impact. He was reviewing the comprehensive legal strategy Sandra Martinez had prepared, which went far beyond a simple lawsuit for damages. "We don't want their money," Malcolm told his team. "We want fundamental change." The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Malcolm Washington, one of the most powerful CEOs in America, defending not just his daughter, but a principle. On the other, an airline scrambling to minimize a PR disaster while underestimating just how thoroughly prepared their opponent would be. And somewhere in between was Deborah Miller, who had already been instructed by airline lawyers to make no public statements as Skylink's strategy shifted from claiming accident to preparing to frame her as a rogue employee whose actions didn't reflect company policy. What none of them yet realized was that the video of the assault was about to go viral in a way that would transform the entire conversation about corporate accountability for discrimination. By the following morning, the video of Jasmine Washington's assault had exploded across social media platforms. Despite Skylink's aggressive attempts to suppress its spread through copyright claims and pressure on news outlets, the footage had been shared, reposted, and commented on millions of times. The hashtag #JusticeForJasmine was trending globally alongside #Boycott Skylink and #Corporate Racism. The clip that gained the most traction wasn't even from Jasmine's own recording, but from Tyler Reynolds' phone. He had captured the aftermath from a different angle, including Deborah Miller's immediate attempt to claim Jasmine had tripped and the airline management's efforts to confiscate evidence. Tyler had posted it to his modest social media following, writing, "Witnessed blatant racism and assault on its Skylink flight today. Black executive at Jasmine Washington targeted, then physically assaulted when she stood up for herself." Within hours, Tyler's post had been shared by celebrities, civil rights leaders, and business figures. His follower count jumped from a few hundred to over 100,000 overnight. When morning news programs began covering the story, they used his footage alongside airport security camera clips that had mysteriously leaked online. CNN business reporter Maya Chen opened her segment with Skylink Airlines is facing unprecedented backlash this morning after disturbing footage emerged of a flight attendant shoving a black executive down a jetway ramp, resulting in injuries requiring medical attention. The victim, Jasmine Washington, is the daughter of Malcolm Washington, CEO of Fortune 500 company Horizon Technologies. The story had all the elements that media found irresistible. A clear villain and victim, dramatic visuals, a powerful family, and the undercurrent of racial discrimination that continued to plague American society. Every major network covered it, each with slightly different emphasis, but the same core narrative. A successful black woman had been assaulted after being singled out for discriminatory treatment. Skylink's initial statement describing the incident as an unfortunate accident was now being roundly mocked across social media. The airline CEO, Thomas Blackwell, had yet to make a public appearance, which only intensified criticism. Inside Skylink headquarters, panic was setting in. The company's stock had plummeted 15% at market open. Corporate partners were publicly distancing themselves. Delta Hotels announced they were reviewing their relationship with the airline. Tech giant Microlink, a major client of Skylink's corporate travel program, issued a statement that they were deeply troubled by the apparent treatment of Miss Washington and awaiting a more substantial response from Skylink leadership. The damage wasn't just external. Internal communications leaked to business journalists revealed a company in chaos. A mid-level manager's email shared anonymously with the Wall Street Journal stated, "We've had complaints about Deborah Miller's treatment of minority passengers before. This was completely preventable if HR had taken those previous incidents seriously." So, by midday, financial analysts were estimating potential damages to Skylink in the hundreds of millions when accounting for boycotts, lawsuits, and long-term reputation damage. Throughout the morning, Jasmine Washington remained in the Chicago hospital for observation due to her concussion symptoms. Her father had established a temporary office in an adjacent room coordinating with his legal and PR teams. Jasmine's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from friends, colleagues, and even strangers who had found her professional social media accounts. A call from Alyssa came through. "Jazz, are you watching the news? This is everywhere. My dad's team is keeping me updated," Jasmine replied, touching the bandage on her forehead gingerly. "It's overwhelming. How are you feeling about all of it?" Alyssa asked. Jasmine paused, considering, "I keep thinking about all the people who experience discrimination every day without the protection of a powerful parent or the ability to make headlines. If this can happen to the daughter of Malcolm Washington in first class, imagine what happens to people without those privileges." Meanwhile, journalists had begun digging into Deborah Miller's background. Old social media posts from her private accounts somehow leaked online revealing troubling statements about minority passengers. In one post from 3 years earlier, she had complained about those people who don't know how to act in first class in reference to a group of black business travelers. Former Skylink employees began coming forward with their own stories. A black former flight attendant gave an interview describing the culture of tolerated bias at the airline. There were certain crew members known for how they treated minority passengers, but complaints would mysteriously disappear from the system. She claimed Tyler Reynolds had become an unexpected central figure in the unfolding story. News outlets sought him out for interviews, which he initially declined, stating he wanted to speak with Jasmine first. When they finally connected by phone, Jasmine thanked him for his intervention. "Most people would have stayed silent," she told him. "You didn't have to get involved?" "Actually, I did," Tyler responded. "We all do. That's the only way things change." With Jasmine's blessing, Tyler agreed to a single interview with a respected journalist. He described everything he had witnessed from the initial discriminatory treatment to the shocking assault. "What struck me most," he concluded, was how routine it seemed, like this was just another day of treating people differently based on how they look. By evening, the story had evolved beyond a single incident to spark a broader conversation about systemic discrimination in the airline industry. Data journalists pulled statistics showing that complaints about discriminatory treatment were significantly higher for black and brown passengers across all major airlines, but particularly at Skylink. Skylink CEO Thomas Blackwell finally appeared at a hastily organized press conference late in the afternoon. Looking uncomfortable and reading stiffly from prepared remarks, he offered a carefully worded apology. Skylink Airlines deeply regrets the incident involving Miss Washington. The behavior displayed does not reflect our company values. We have placed the employee in question on administrative leave and are conducting a thorough investigation. We have reached out to Miss Washington and her family to express our sincere apologies and to make appropriate amends. The response was immediately criticized for its vagueness, lack of acknowledgement of the discriminatory nature of the incident, and the implication that it was an isolated occurrence rather than symptomatic of broader issues. The hashtag number Too Little Too Late quickly joined the trending topics related to the incident. Skylink CEO Thomas Blackwell finally appeared at a hastily organized press conference late in the afternoon. Looking uncomfortable and reading stiffly from prepared remarks, he offered a carefully worded apology. As night fell, Malcolm Washington issued his first public statement through Horizon Technologies' official channels. "We intend to use every resource at our disposal to create meaningful change." The statement was accompanied by the announcement that Horizon Technologies had retained a prestigious civil rights law firm to pursue legal action against Skylink. In the hospital room, Jasmine watched as her personal experience transformed into a national conversation about race corporate accountability and privilege. It was simultaneously empowering and overwhelming. She had always known her father to be a formidable businessman, but now she was witnessing firsthand how he channeled that same strategic thinking and resource deployment toward fighting injustice. "We don't have to do all this," she told him when they had a moment alone. "The publicity is already more than I expected." Malcolm took his daughter's hand gently. "This isn't just about what happened to you, though. That would be reason enough. This is about using our position to create change that helps everyone. Your mother always said that privilege isn't just something you enjoy. It's something you leverage for good." The mention of her mother, who had passed away 5 years earlier from breast cancer, brought tears to Jasmine's eyes. Marissa Washington had been a civil rights attorney before her illness, often taking pro cases for those who had experienced discrimination. "She would be proud of how you handled yourself," Malcolm added softly, documenting everything, staying calm, speaking up clearly. As Jasmine drifted off to sleep that night, exhausted from the day's events and still recovering from her concussion, the video of her assault continued to spread across the globe. In homes, offices, and online forums, people debated corporate responsibility, racial bias, and accountability. And in the Skylink boardroom, executives held an emergency session as they realized that this crisis was far beyond their usual damage control protocols. What none of them yet knew was that a former Skylink employee had just contacted Malcolm Washington's legal team with internal documents showing that complaints against Deborah Miller had been systematically buried for years, and that this cover-up went all the way to senior management. 5 days after the assault, as Jasmine Washington returned to her apartment in Atlanta with a healing gash on her forehead and a new sense of purpose, the story had evolved far beyond a single incident. What had begun as an individual case of discrimination had blossomed into a full-scale investigation of systemic issues within Skylink Airlines and the industry as a whole. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Rebecca Chen published a damning expose in The Atlantic titled "The Unfriendly Skies Inside Skylink's Culture of Discrimination." The piece detailed dozens of incidents spanning the past decade where passengers of color had filed complaints about discriminatory treatment, the vast majority of which had been dismissed or buried. Chen had managed to obtain internal email correspondence showing that Skylink executives had a policy of settling the most potentially damaging cases quietly with non-disclosure agreements while ignoring or dismissing the rest. In reviewing over 200 discrimination complaints filed against Skylink in the past 5 years, Chen wrote, "A disturbing pattern emerges. Less than 2% resulted in any disciplinary action against employees, despite substantial evidence in many cases. Meanwhile, the company's internal diversity training consists of a single 30-minute video that hasn't been updated since 2012. The article specifically highlighted Deborah Miller's history. She had been the subject of 17 formal complaints from minority passengers over her 15-year career, none of which had resulted in consequences. In fact, documentation showed she had received consistently positive performance reviews, with one supervisor noting her ability to maintain order and standards in the cabin. As the article circulated, former Skylink employees began speaking out in greater numbers. A former HR manager created an anonymous email account to contact both journalists and Malcolm Washington's legal team, providing internal documents showing that complaints against certain employees, including Miller, had been deliberately misclassified to keep them out of official discrimination statistics. When a passenger would complain about racist treatment, the former employee explained in an interview with CNN their identity concealed and voice altered. Managers were trained to reclassify it as a customer service misunderstanding or procedural dispute rather than a discrimination complaint. This allowed them to report artificially low numbers of bias incidents to the Department of Transportation. Despite her doctor's recommendation that she rests, Jasmine had thrown herself into working with the legal team. From her apartment converted temporarily into a command center, she coordinated with attorneys, reviewed documents, and spoke with other victims of discrimination who had reached out after seeing her story. "What happened to me was traumatic," Jasmine explained during a brief phone interview with a respected business publication. "But I've realized that my position of privilege gives me an opportunity to create change for people who don't have the resources or platform that I do." She had assembled a timeline of her experience, annotating each moment of discriminatory treatment leading up to the assault. Working with psychologists and bias experts, she helped document how seemingly small actions, the different tone used with her versus white passengers, the repeated ID checks the plastic cup instead of glass, formed a pattern of othering that created the environment where physical assault became possible. Meanwhile, Tyler Reynolds had become an unexpected ally in the fight. After his initial interview went viral, he had been contacted by other witnesses from different Skylink flights who had observed similar discrimination. He created a secure online portal where people could submit their experiences, which he then forwarded to Jasmine's legal team after verification. "As a white man, I've flown countless times without ever experiencing what Miss Washington went through," Tyler explained in a widely shared social media post. "That's not coincidence. It's systemic bias. And those of us with privilege have a responsibility to speak up when we witness it." The Federal Aviation Administration and Department of Transportation had both launched formal investigations into Skylink's practices. Congressional representatives called for hearings on discrimination in the airline industry, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission began reviewing hiring and promotion practices at the airline after several former employees of color came forward with claims that they had been passed over for advancement despite superior qualifications and performance. Deborah Miller herself had gone into hiding after her address was published online, forcing her to relocate temporarily. Skylink had provided her with legal counsel, but was clearly positioning to make her the scapegoat for what was increasingly being revealed as a company-wide problem. In a leaked memo, a Skylink executive had written, "We need to focus responsibility on Miller's actions as those of a rogue employee who violated our policies rather than indicative of broader issues." This strategy was undermined when an investigative team discovered Deborah's social media history, which included several posts with racial overtones. Most damning was a private group she belonged to, where flight attendants from various airlines shared stories about passengers, many of which contained racist tropes and mockery of passengers' accents or names. But perhaps the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Helen Richards, the only woman and only person of color on Skylink's board of directors, reached out privately to Malcolm Washington. As a former airline executive herself, before joining the board, she had been pushing for improved diversity training and accountability for years, only to be consistently outvoted. "I can't continue to be part of a system that enables this kind of behavior," she told Malcolm during their confidential meeting. "I'm prepared to provide documentation showing that the board was specifically warned about discrimination complaints increasing under the current leadership and chose to ignore the data." This information was potentially explosive evidence that the highest levels of Skylink leadership had been aware of and chosen to disregard patterns of discrimination. Helen Richards was taking an enormous professional risk. But as she explained to Malcolm, sometimes you have to decide which side of history you want to be on. Back in her apartment, Jasmine was reviewing these latest developments with her father and their lead attorney, Sandra Martinez, when her phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had sent her a direct message on social media with a video attachment. The video showed Supervisor Craig Peters, the man who had initially sided with Deborah Miller during the boarding conflict, speaking to a group of employees during what appeared to be a training session from the previous year. "Look, we all know some passengers can be difficult," Peters could be heard saying, "especially those who don't typically fly first class and don't know how to behave. Your job is to maintain standards even if that ruffles some feathers." While he never explicitly mentioned race, the context and subtle coding were clear to anyone familiar with discrimination in the service industry. The video had been recorded secretly by an employee who had since left the company. This could be crucial, Sandra Martinez noted, immediately downloading the video and adding it to their evidence file. It shows that supervisors were essentially training staff to profile passengers. Malcolm nodded, his expression grim. This goes deeper than one flight attendant or one incident. This is about an entire corporate culture that enables and even encourages discrimination. Jasmine, looking at the growing mountain of evidence they had accumulated in less than a week, felt a mix of vindication and sadness. The worst part is how preventable this all was, she said softly. How many people reported these issues over the years, only to be ignored or silenced? That evening, Skylink CEO Thomas Blackwell made another public appearance, this time on a major business news network. His tone had shifted from the carefully neutral corporate speak of his earlier statement to one of apparent concern. "We are taking these allegations extremely seriously," he insisted. "We have hired an independent consulting firm to review our practices and policies. Skylink has zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind." When the interviewer pointed out the mounting evidence suggesting discrimination had been systematic and ongoing for years, Blackwell appeared flustered. "We can't comment on specific personnel matters or ongoing investigations," he replied stiffly. "But we are committed to making whatever changes are necessary to ensure all passengers are treated with respect." The interview was widely criticized as too little too late. One social media commenter summarized the public sentiment. They had years to address this zero-tolerance policy, but only care now that it's hurting their stock price. Indeed, Skylink's financial situation was becoming dire. The stock had lost nearly 30% of its value in the week since the incident. Corporate clients were suspending their contracts and passengers were booking away from the airline in droves, with competitor carriers reporting significant increases in bookings. As the investigation continued to uncover layer after layer of problematic behavior, Malcolm and Jasmine Washington prepared for what would be the most crucial phase of their response. Direct negotiations with Skylink leadership that would determine not just compensation for Jasmine's experience, but potentially transform how an entire industry addressed issues of racial bias. What they didn't yet know was that CEO Thomas Blackwell had secretly reached out to Warren Mitchell, the retired founder of Skylink, who still held significant stock in the company. Mitchell, now in his 80s, had been watching the unfolding crisis with growing dismay from his retirement home in Florida. And he had just boarded his private jet, headed for a meeting that would dramatically alter the trajectory of the conflict. 10 days after the assault, the boardroom on the top floor of Skylink's Chicago headquarters was tense with anticipation. On one side of the long mahogany table sat CEO Thomas Blackwell, flanked by his executive team and a phalanx of attorneys. Their faces were grim, reflecting the company's plummeting stock and the wave of negative publicity that had engulfed them. On the other side, Malcolm Washington sat with Jasmine and their legal team, led by Sandra Martinez. Jasmine's presence was powerful, the healing wound on her forehead still visible, a physical reminder of why they were all gathered there. She wore a tailored burgundy suit, projecting the confidence and composure that had become her trademark throughout this ordeal. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Blackwell began, his tone carefully modulated. "We hope to resolve this unfortunate situation amicably." Malcolm's expression remained neutral. "Let's be clear about what we're discussing here. Mr. Blackwell, this is not an unfortunate situation. My daughter was assaulted by your employee after being subjected to discriminatory treatment, and as our investigation has revealed, this reflects a pattern of behavior that your company has ignored for years." Blackwell shifted uncomfortably. "We acknowledge that Ms. Washington's experience was unacceptable. That's why we're prepared to offer substantial compensation." He nodded to one of his attorneys, who slid a document across the table. "This settlement offer includes significant financial compensation and a mutual non-disclosure agreement." Sandra Martinez barely glanced at the document before passing it to Malcolm, who didn't even open it. "Mr. Blackwell," Malcolm said, "evenly, if you think this is about money, you've profoundly misunderstood our purpose here." Nevertheless, Blackwell pressed the offer is quite generous. 7 figures tax-free. Jasmine, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward slightly. "What would that NDA prevent me from discussing?" The Skylink attorney answered smoothly. Standard language. You wouldn't be able to discuss the details of the incident or the terms of the settlement. So I couldn't talk about the racial discrimination I experienced, Jasmine clarified. I couldn't share my story to help others recognize and respond to similar treatment. That's correct, the attorney confirmed. It would bring closure to this matter for all parties. Jasmine exchanged a glance with her father. A silent communication built on years of trust and shared values. Malcolm nodded slightly and pulled a folder from his briefcase. We're not interested in your financial offer, Malcolm stated. Instead, we have our own proposal. He distributed copies of a document to everyone at the table. These are the changes we believe are necessary for Skylink to address its systemic issues with discrimination. Blackwell frowned as he scanned the document. This is extensive, it's comprehensive, Malcolm corrected. It includes mandatory anti-racism training developed by experts, not the outdated half-hour video you currently use. It requires diversity at all levels of leadership, including the board. It creates transparent reporting of all discrimination complaints and clear consequences for violations, and it establishes an independent oversight committee to ensure compliance. The Skylink executives exchanged troubled glances. The head of human resources spoke up. These changes would cost millions to implement and would require years to fully execute. The cost of not implementing them will be far higher, Sandra Martinez countered, both financially and to your company's reputation. Blackwell's expression hardened. While we appreciate your suggestions, ultimately Skylink must determine its own policies and procedures. We're prepared to increase our settlement offer substantially if that would help reach a resolution. Malcolm leaned back in his chair. You still don't understand. This isn't a negotiation where you can simply throw more money at the problem. This is an opportunity for meaningful change. Your only opportunity before we proceed with legal action that will include not just Jasmine's case, but a class action lawsuit representing dozens of others who have experienced similar discrimination. The tension in the room thickened. Jasmine, despite doctors' orders to avoid stress during her recovery, had insisted on attending this meeting. Now seeing the resistance from Skylink leadership, she decided it was time to speak directly. Mr. Blackwell, she began, her voice steady before I was assaulted. I was an executive who happened to be a black woman. Now I find myself becoming an unwilling symbol of something much larger. Every day, I receive messages from people who have experienced what I did. Not the physical assault necessarily, but the small indignities, the different treatment, the assumption that they don't belong in certain spaces. She touched her forehead gently. This wound will heal, but the damage done by systemic discrimination doesn't heal unless it's addressed directly. Your company has an opportunity to lead here to set a standard for the entire industry. Or you can continue to pretend this is an isolated incident while paying out settlements that do nothing to prevent the next assault. A moment of silence followed Jasmine's words. Then, unexpectedly, a new voice entered the conversation. Mr. Blackwell. She began, her voice steady before I was assaulted. I was an executive who happened to be a black woman. Now I find myself becoming an unwilling symbol of something much larger. Every day I receive messages from people who have experienced what I did. Not the physical assault necessarily, but the small indignities, the different treatment, the assumption that they don't belong in certain spaces. All heads turned toward the boardroom door where Warren Mitchell stood. At 84, the founder of Skylink still commanded attention with his tall frame and piercing blue eyes. Though he had retired from active management a decade earlier, he remained the company's largest individual shareholder. Warren Blackwell said, clearly surprised, "We weren't expecting you." Clearly, Mitchell replied dryly, walking slowly to the table. "I've been watching this situation unfold from Florida. I've seen the videos, read the reports, and spoken with Helen Richards about the concerns she's raised in board meetings for years." He turned to Jasmine. "Miss Washington, first let me offer my personal apology for what you experienced. The airline I founded was built on a principle of treating every passenger with dignity. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that. Jasmine nodded her acknowledgement, studying the man whose company had caused her so much pain, yet who now seemed genuinely disturbed by what had happened. Mitchell turned back to the Skylink team. "I've reviewed the proposal from the Washingtons. It's not just reasonable, it's necessary. And if this board won't implement these changes, then perhaps we need a different board." The implication was clear. As the largest shareholder, Mitchell still wielded considerable influence. Blackwell's face wrined. "Warren, with all due respect, you're not actively involved in operations anymore. The airline industry has changed. These proposed measures would put us at a competitive disadvantage." Mitchell shook his head. "That's where you're wrong, Tom. Doing the right thing is never a competitive disadvantage. It's your refusal to address these issues that has cost us millions in the past week alone." Helen Richards, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. "Our internal data supports this. When we've made efforts toward better inclusivity, even small ones, customer satisfaction scores improved across all demographics." Blackwell looked increasingly isolated as more voices around the table began to express support for the Washington proposal. His face flushed with anger as he realized he was losing control of the meeting. "This is absurd," he snapped. "We can't allow outside parties to dictate company policy based on a single incident." The words had barely left his mouth when he realized his mistake. The room went silent as all eyes turned to Jasmine, whose composed expression never wavered, despite the dismissal of her traumatic experience as merely a single incident. What Blackwell didn't realize was that his microphone, which had been set up for the meeting's virtual participants, was still active. His words were transmitted to several regional vice presidents who were listening, in one of whom was so disturbed by the CEO's characterization that they immediately recorded the comment and anonymously sent it to a journalist who had been covering the story. Malcolm Washington stood signaling that the meeting was over from his perspective. "Mr. Blackwell, we came here in good faith offering a path forward. Your response makes it clear that Skylink's leadership is not seriously committed to addressing the systemic issues that led to my daughter's assault. We'll proceed accordingly." As the Washington team gathered their materials, Warren Mitchell made an unexpected move. "Before you leave, I'd like to make a proposal of my own." All eyes turned to the company founder. The board has emergency powers to make leadership changes when the company faces extraordinary circumstances. Mitchell stated, "I believe we've reached that point. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current CEO and the appointment of an interim leader who can implement the changes needed." The words had barely left his mouth when he realized his mistake. The room went silent as all eyes turned to Jasmine, whose composed expression never wavered despite the dismissal of her traumatic experience as merely a single incident. "Actually, we can," Helen Richards interjected, pulling out her tablet. "Bylaw 17.3 allows for emergency action when the company faces imminent and substantial threat to its financial viability. Our stock has lost 30% of its value in 10 days. That qualifies." For the next hour, an extraordinary boardroom drama unfolded as the Washington team watched. Phone calls were made to absent board members. Legal opinions were hastily obtained. And through it all, Warren Mitchell stood firm in his conviction that Skylink needed a fundamental reset. By the end of the day, Thomas Blackwell had been removed as CEO by a narrow board vote. And in a move that shocked the corporate world, Helen Richards was appointed as interim CEO, the first black woman to lead a major American airline. As they left the Skylink headquarters, Malcolm placed a protective arm around his daughter's shoulders. "This isn't over," he cautioned. "Corporate culture doesn't change overnight." Jasmine nodded, her expression thoughtful, "But it's a start, a real start." What neither of them could have anticipated was how Deborah Miller, watching these events unfold from her temporary hideaway, was about to make a decision that would add yet another unexpected dimension to this already extraordinary story. 6 months had passed since the fateful day on the Skylink jetway. The airline industry, long resistant to change despite periodic scandals, had undergone a remarkable transformation, one that industry analysts were still struggling to fully comprehend. In the bright, airy conference room of Horizon Technologies' Atlanta headquarters, Jasmine Washington stood before a diverse group of airline executives from across the country. The small scar on her forehead had faded, but remained visible, a permanent reminder of the incident that had catalyzed industry-wide change. The Washington Protocol isn't just about avoiding lawsuits or bad publicity, Jasmine explained, indicating the comprehensive training manual that bore her family name. It's about recognizing that excellence in service cannot exist alongside bias, whether conscious or unconscious. The executives listened attentively, most of them newly appointed following the seismic shifts in airline leadership that had occurred in the wake of the Skylink scandal. Among them was Helen Richards, no longer interim, but now the permanently appointed CEO of Skylink Airlines, whose bold leadership had not only stabilized the company, but begun to restore its reputation. Skylink's transformation had been both swift and profound. Under Helen's direction, the entire executive team had been restructured to reflect the diversity of the customers they served. The board, previously dominated by older white men from similar backgrounds, now included representatives from various racial and ethnic groups, as well as experts in civil rights and corporate ethics. More significantly, every aspect of company operations had been examined through the lens of potential bias. Flight attendant training had been completely overhauled with extensive modules on recognizing and countering unconscious bias. Complaint procedures had been redesigned to ensure transparency and accountability. And most importantly, the company had created an independent oversight committee with real power to investigate allegations of discrimination and recommend binding remedies. The changes had not come without resistance. Several longtime executives had resigned rather than adapt to the new culture. Some shareholders had initially protested what they viewed as unnecessary expenses related to diversity initiatives. But as Skylink's reputation began to recover and customers returned, those voices had gradually quieted. In the bright, airy conference room of Horizon Technologies' Atlanta headquarters, Jasmine Washington stood before a diverse group of airline executives from across the country. The small scar on her forehead had faded, but remained visible, a permanent reminder of the incident that had catalyzed industry-wide change. What had begun as one company's crisis response had expanded into an industry-wide reckoning. Other airlines, seeing both the pitfalls of ignoring discrimination and the potential benefits of embracing meaningful change, had approached Horizon Technologies for guidance. Malcolm Washington, recognizing the opportunity, had established a new corporate consulting division specializing in anti-discrimination practices and cultural transformation. The data is clear, she told the assembled executives, advancing to the next slide in her presentation. Companies that implement these protocols don't just avoid negative incidents, they actually see improved customer satisfaction across all demographics and higher employee retention rates. Seated near the back of the room was Tyler Reynolds, who had joined Horizon's Corporate Responsibility Department 3 months earlier. His decision to speak up on that fateful flight had transformed his own career trajectory, leading him from marketing to a role where he could help other companies recognize and address bias before it led to incidents like the one he had witnessed. The most common question we receive is whether this level of change is really necessary. Tyler added, standing to join Jasmine at the front of the room. The answer is unequivocally yes, because discrimination doesn't just hurt its direct victims, it undermines the integrity of your entire organization. As the presentation concluded and the executives broke into smaller discussion groups, Jasmine stepped out into the hallway for a moment of quiet reflection. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of activity. From testifying before congressional committees on airline industry practices to working with psychologists to develop trauma-informed training approaches. Malcolm joined her, his expression proud. "Your mother would be amazed at what you've accomplished," he said softly. Jasmine smiled. "I was just thinking about her, about how she always said that change happens when principle meets opportunity." Malcolm nodded. "She was right. What happened to you was terrible, but you've turned it into something powerful." Their conversation was interrupted by Helen Richards, who approached with a tablet in hand. "I think you'll want to see this," she said, passing the device to Jasmine. On the screen was an article from a major business publication titled "From Villain to Advocate Deborah Miller's Unexpected Journey." The piece detailed how the flight attendant who had assaulted Jasmine had undergone a profound personal transformation during the past months. After being fired from Skylink, Deborah had initially retreated into bitterness and denial. But as the story continued to unfold and more evidence emerged of systemic problems within the airline, she had been forced to confront her own role in perpetuating discrimination. Surprisingly, she had reached out to anti-racism educators and begun a journey of understanding her own biases. Most remarkably, Deborah had started speaking publicly about her experience, using herself as a cautionary tale for other service industry workers. "I believed I was just enforcing rules," the article quoted her saying. "I never thought of myself as racist, but I've had to face the truth that I treated people differently based on their race, even when I wasn't consciously aware of doing so." The article explained that Deborah now worked with a non-profit organization that provided bias training to service industry employees, sharing her story as a powerful example of how unchecked biases could escalate to harmful behavior. Jasmine read the article in silence, her expression thoughtful. "I never expected this," she finally said. "None of us did," Helen agreed. "But it speaks to the ripple effects of what you started. Change is happening at every level." Later that afternoon, as the executives departed with their copies of the Washington Protocol, Malcolm and Jasmine stood in his office overlooking the Atlanta skyline. On his desks had advanced copies of their co-authored book, Beyond Bias Corporate Accountability and Racial Equity, which was already generating significant pre-publication buzz. 1 year ago today, Malcolm noted, checking his calendar, "You were preparing for that Chicago business trip. Could you have imagined any of this?" Jasmine shook her head. "Not in my wildest dreams or nightmares." She touched her scar lightly. "But I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately, about what we're really building here." Malcolm looked at his daughter inquiringly. "Skylink has changed," she continued. "Other airlines are following suit, but what happens 5 years from now? 10, when this isn't headline news anymore and shareholders start pressuring for cost cutting?" Malcolm smiled. "That's exactly why we're doing all of this, the protocol, the book, the consulting division. We're not just changing policies, we're changing culture. And culture, when it's truly transformed, doesn't slide back so easily." 1 week later, Jasmine found herself at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, preparing to board a flight for the first time since the assault. She had chosen this trip deliberately. Same airport, same destination, even the same airline. Though Skylink was now a very different company, as she approached the gate, she felt a flutter of anxiety, memories of her last experience threatening to overwhelm her. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of how much had changed. The gate agent greeted her with professional courtesy, scanning her boarding pass without comment about her first-class status. As Jasmine moved toward the jetway, she noticed the small camera now positioned to record all boarding interactions. One of many accountability measures implemented under Helen Richards' leadership on board. The flight crew reflected the diversity initiative that Skylink had implemented, with crew members from various backgrounds working seamlessly together. The lead flight attendant, a black man in his 40s, welcomed her aboard with the same warm efficiency he showed to every passenger. As Jasmine settled into her seat, she noticed something on the seat back in front of her. A small card outlining passengers' rights and the airline's commitment to equal treatment, with a QR code linking to a direct reporting system. For any concerns, it was a small thing perhaps, but a tangible symbol of the changes she had helped create. As she approached the gate, she felt a flutter of anxiety, memories of her last experience threatening to overwhelm her. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of how much had changed. As she exited the jetway, she noticed a familiar face waiting in the terminal. Tyler Reynolds, holding a small sign that read simply, "Full Circle." The gate agent greeted her with professional courtesy, scanning her boarding pass without comment about her first-class status. As Jasmine moved toward the jetway, she noticed the small camera now positioned to record all boarding interactions. One of many accountability measures implemented under Helen Richards' leadership. The flight itself was uneventful, exactly as air travel should be. As the plane landed in Atlanta and passengers prepared to deplane, Jasmine felt a sense of closure. The trauma would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her future. They walked together through the terminal, discussing the latest developments in their work. The Washington Protocol was being adopted by transportation companies beyond just airlines. Hotels, cruise lines, and even retail chains had begun implementing versions of it tailored to their industries. 1 year to the day after the assault, Skylink Airlines held a press conference announcing the completion of its transformation initiative. Helen Richards, standing confidently at the podium, detailed the changes that had been implemented across every level of the company. Completely normal, Jasmine replied with a smile. Exactly as it should be. We've created a model that prioritizes dignity for every passenger and employee, Helen explained to the assembled journalists. And while the catalyst for these changes was painful, we're grateful to Jasmine Washington for holding us accountable and showing us a better path forward. After the press conference, Helen approached Jasmine with an unexpected request. We're establishing a permanent ethics advisory board, she explained. Independent voices who will help ensure we never slide backward. We'd be honored if you would consider serving as its inaugural chairperson. Jasmine was surprised. You know I won't pull any punches, she warned. Helen smiled. That's exactly why we need you. That evening, at a small celebration dinner with her father Tyler and close friends who had supported her throughout the ordeal, Jasmine raised a glass in a toast. To my mother, she said, her voice filled with emotion. Who taught us that? When you have the privilege to speak up, you have the responsibility to do so, Malcolm added his own toast. And to all those who don't have the platform or protection that we had, whose stories go untold, and whose dignity is violated daily, our work continues for them. The transformation sparked by one moment of violence on an airport jetway had rippled outward, touching countless lives and changing an industry. But for Jasmine Washington, the most profound change had been personal, discovering her own voice and purpose in a way she never could have anticipated. As corporate policies reformed and public awareness grew, as books were published and protocols implemented, the question remained, would these changes endure? Only time would tell. But Jasmine was committed to ensuring that they would, that her experience would continue to transform boardrooms and break barriers until equal treatment became not just a policy, but a reality for everyone. This powerful story teaches us that meaningful change often begins with individual courage. When Jasmine maintained her composure and documented her experience, she transformed a personal trauma into systemic change. It shows that privilege comes with responsibility. Malcolm and Jasmine used their position not just for personal justice, but to create pathways for others without their resources. The story demonstrates how accountability works not through quiet settlements, but through transparent transformation of problematic systems. We see that true allies like Tyler Reynolds and Helen Richards are essential people willing to risk their comfort to stand for justice. Most importantly, the story reveals that discrimination isn't solved through superficial training, but through comprehensive cultural change at every level. Real progress requires both individual bravery and collective commitment to sustaining new standards of dignity for everyone, regardless of their appearance or background. What discrimination have you witnessed or experienced in your daily life? How did you respond? Share your stories in the comments below to help others recognize and address similar situations. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that expose injustice and celebrate transformation. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the impact of discrimination and the power of speaking up. Thank you for watching Airline and Chaos. Remember, change isn't just about policies. It's about people choosing to stand for dignity every single day. Be that person in your